All right, hello, welcome to Sex Talk with Natasha. This is Natasha, and we are coming at you from a lot of different places: Wichita, Kansas, California, and I'm not sure where Stacy's at. Where you at, Stacy?
Austin, Texas.
Ooh. All
Yeah.
right, and today we're going to talk about a really important topic, which is this idea of how to talk to younger kids in particular about body boundaries, body safety, how to prepare them in ways that we can empower them to avoid issues such as sexual assault, sexual abuse, and even inappropriate play with other kids. So lots to talk about there. And but before we go there, I just want to give a little information about Sex Talk and what this is all about. So this is an adult comprehensive sexual education experience where you get to interact with me and other patrons if you're a subscriber on a lot of different ways. So one is through these Facebook Live events, of which we do every Wednesday night. And we're answering questions of people who come on the show, guests who come on the show, and anybody can submit to do that. You don't have to necessarily be a patron to be a guest on the show. So if you have a question you want me to address, please feel free to come on, and you can do it in person like Stacy's doing tonight, or we can do it anonymously where we kind of black you out and you can come on as an anonymous guest. And the whole idea here with Sex Talk is that I believe in the process of a sexual journey. I believe that most of us have some sort of sexual healing to address in our lives because we grow up in cultures that are primarily sex negative, whether those are the family backgrounds we come from, religious backgrounds we come from, cultural backgrounds we come from, etc. So I think we can all use some help in this arena. And I also think it's a huge part of our health and our wellness, our self-image, our self-esteem, pleasure, lots of wonderful things that if we are in healthier spaces with our sexuality, we can really benefit from. So I feel very passionate about this work. I'm a certified sex therapist, and I'm really excited to have lots of you be able to benefit from something of this sort. We have a community forum. I give daily actions. I write blogs. I offer online courses. And here in the near future, we're going to be also offering some online groups. So look forward to more information about that. We can't do this without subscribers. So make sure that if you're finding any value in this at all, to please subscribe, go to Patreon, and Ashley, our producer, will tell you a little bit more about that. So Ashley, let me pass it over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for joining tonight. We're really excited to be here. So for those that are just starting to become familiar with the show, we do this every week. It is a hour-long program, and the way it's broken up is the first 15-20 minutes or so, Natasha is going to teach us a little bit about the topic. And then after that, we bring on our guest, and every week we have a guest, and today we have Stacy, who's great. So just wait, she's great. So you'll see. And then we always want to leave open the last 10-15 minutes to our audience questions. So if you have any questions at all, please go ahead and send them to us. You can either comment on the post, you can send us a direct message. This is for you guys. So we want to make sure we get to it all for you. The first 30 minutes are free on Facebook. The entire episode is on Patreon. So like Natasha said, there's some great resources over there. You get this entire episode. So head over to patreon.com/sextalkwithnatasha. And if anybody does want to see Natasha professionally, you can visit her online practice at Symmetry Solutions. And you can find that at symmetrysols.com. So I'll turn it back over to Natasha.
All right, thanks. So this is a very important topic. So I have a lot of thoughts to share about it, and I hope my thoughts don't get in the way of Stacy being able to ask me questions. So I'm going to try to zip through these, and I shortened my list to 13 things. So it's a lot of things. So I'm like, I need to do this quickly. And just to be clear, I think, Stacy, you had mentioned that your kids are younger, like 5 and younger. And so really most of my thoughts today are going to kids who are probably like 10 younger, so pre-adolescent and younger, which, if you've heard me at all talk about educating kids about sexuality, I think that this is something we do from the womb. And why I mean that is because our sexual education starts with our own sexual ideas, our own sexual biases, our own sexual anxieties, our own sexual stories and narratives. So much of what we're communicating to our kids comes from our own selves. So it starts from day one. And all right, so my number one tip as I hold my iPhone is that I believe that these conversations with our kids are ongoing. This is not a one-time sit-down discussion. Even if you were to sit down and try to share 13 points with your kids, I'm guessing they'd be glazed over pretty quickly, right? So these are all tips that you want to have kind of in the back of your mind and find ways to incorporate them into day-to-day talks and activities and things that you notice with your children on an ongoing basis, because they're not going to retain just a one-time discussion with you on these topics. So number two is, I think it's really important to watch your tone. So a lot of our communication happens not necessarily with what we're saying, but how we're saying it. And so if you sit down and you're like, I have something really important and heavy to talk to you about, and all your anxieties coming through your body language, that's going to be a little bit more like, whoa, this is something that I'm uncomfortable with, or mom or dad is uncomfortable with, or I might be in trouble about, right? Whereas if we can just be like, yep, this is how it works, or casual tones, or this is just some information I'm giving out in a more casual way, that says a lot to a child about how approachable you are, about how, even though the topic is serious, that if something happens, it's not the end of the world, and they're probably more than likely to see you as an approachable person to come talk to about, instead of it being very, very dramatic. So that's my number two tip. Number three tip is to name the body parts from the get-go correctly. So instead of that's your bottom, that's your butt, or that's your vulva, or that's your penis, or those are your testicles. And if you don't want to use testicles, at least use words that are still pretty clear, like those are your balls, or that's your scrotum, or that's your vagina. I don't know that it's very helpful to teach girls just the one word, vagina, for their entire vulvar area. Because when and if there is issues of sexual assault, it can be really important for kids to be able to talk about what exactly happened to them. And if they just say, well, he touched my bottom. Well, for a lot of kids, that could mean my vulva, or it can mean something different because they don't know the actual names. So just naming their body parts doesn't mean that you have to necessarily always use them. It's not like you're going to walk around like a anatomical encyclopedia every time you talk to your kids, but to have at least some sense that at some point you're teaching the correct terminology for things. So even if they call it the pee-pee, after a while, you can still every now and then say that's the penis. Okay. Number four tip is to really start very early talking about private, the word private. So some parts are private. Yep, that's your vulva. Yep, that's your penis. Yep, that's your clitoris, right? Or that's your anus. Those parts are private. Those are your parts. Those are your, parts that are private. Some people might use the word special. I'm not a huge fan of special because I think all body parts are special. And sometimes making too big of a deal about genitals can also be problematic, but they're different. They're private parts, and they're your parts, and you have a lot of say about what happens with those parts. So if a kid is touching themselves, in the living room in front of everybody, hey, you can touch your parts, but let's do that in private, right? Let's do that in a space where you can be alone with your parts. So that idea of privacy, that it's only for you, can be really important. And then to be able to talk about when are the exceptions to the rules. So when they're little, it's like, oh, mommy is washing your private parts with a wash rag, right? So I do that because I'm your mommy and I'm teaching you how to do that. Pretty soon, as you get a little bit older, you only get to do that. Mommy won't do that anymore because that's your private parts, right? So those are kind of some examples of how you can talk to little ones about that. When you go to the doctor, well, the doctor has to check your private parts because all your parts have to get checked. We need to make sure all your parts are healthy. But a doctor can only do that if there's a nurse in the room or if mommy or daddy are in the room, right? So there always has to be somebody in the room with you. Because those are private parts, and that's why it's important. So that's some of the ways you can talk to kids about privacy. Number 5 tip is to really start early with body boundaries. So only you get to touch your privates. Somebody may ask you to touch their privates. We forget about this sometimes. Many times predators actually do not touch privates first. They ask for the child to touch their privates. So if somebody asks you to touch their privates, that's not an okay touch. That's and we'll talk about this in another point, but I like the word secret touch versus good or bad touch, because good or bad can have a lot of different meanings for people, and certain things can feel good or bad that aren't necessarily good or bad, right? So a doctor touching me doesn't necessarily feel very good, but I wouldn't call that a bad touch, right? So I think a secret touch might be a better way to talk about that. And I've seen some articles where they talk about that being a good terminology. So you want to talk about touch both ways, that nobody gets to touch you. You don't get to touch other people's private parts. If a grown-up or somebody like that wants you to touch their private parts, that's not okay. Another part of boundaries that I think is important is nobody gets to take pictures of your private parts. Okay, so that's, the technology world that we live in, or videos of your private parts. And to really focus on, this is true with who? With family, with friends, right? With grown-ups. But even when you're playing with your cousins or with your brother or sister, if you're in the bathtub, a lot of times, I started this pretty early, right? With like a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and the 4-year-old all of a sudden starts touching the 2-year-old. And I'm like, oh, guess what? That's a private part. And you don't get to touch your brother's private part, right?
Yes.
Like, oh, and it's not, but I didn't go, oh my gosh, stop touching your brother's, it's just like, oh, guess what we just get to learn about, right? So that's going back to the tone. The tone is important. And I even give kind of examples to my kids. So not that I want to call anybody out, but I'm like, even if it's, T.O. Chris, or even if it's Grandpa Bob, right? Or even though it's Aunt Jenny, not that I think any of those people would do anything, but I want them to have examples that I'm actually calling out, even if it's mom or dad. Mom and dad don't get to do this, right? Even if it's your older brother. So I call out names so that they have examples, because the reality is that sexual abuse and assault really happens most often in family systems and neighborhoods and church communities with trusted people that we know. So, so you want them to be alerted to that. All right, my number 6 point is this idea that body secrets are not okay. Oftentimes, predators will threaten the child with secret. You have to keep this secret. If you don't keep this secret, I'm going to tell your mommy or daddy this, or I'm going to hurt your mom or dad, right? Or I'm going to hurt you, or whatever those kinds of threats can be. So just saying, you know what? We don't keep secrets. I say that in general in my house. We're just not a secret keeping family, right? So we talk about things in our family, but when it comes to our body, we definitely want to say, I don't necessarily we don't keep body secrets. And if anybody ever tells you that kind of stuff, that's just a lie. That's just a lie. It's okay to tell us that. Nobody's going to hurt you if you say something like that. Number 7 point, practice things that they can say or do. So the number 1 response when somebody is approached by a predator is the freeze response. And not just even predators. I think, again, playing doctor, having an older friend, right? That's maybe just, or a friend that's over for sleepover. I wouldn't call these, predatorial situations, but they can be child play situations where one child isn't quite sure how to respond to the other child's request or playfulness or creativity or curiosity. So how do they have things that they can practice? So how do you practice? What can you say? And you come up with several things. No, no, right? Or I don't want to. Or how about let's do this instead, right? If it's a friend. Or leave me alone. Or if it's with a grown-up, sometimes I say to my kids, regardless of the situation, is I need to go to the bathroom. Most people aren't going to stop you from going to the bathroom, right? And so it's like that gives you some time to like go lock yourself in the bathroom. Maybe the kid is old enough to have a phone or something. They can text home, or they can call, or they can do something to try to help themselves, you know, kind of gather their wits about them. So in order to help against that freeze response, we need to help them practice just a few ways that they have language, that they've actually practiced with you, role played. Things that they can say. Number 8, and this is a little harder one for younger kids, but a lot of kids have phones these days by 9, 10, 11, is to have a family safe word. So if they're at a sleepover, they don't necessarily want to text, you know, Mom, come get me, I'm scared, right? Or they don't want to necessarily call and say something like that. So a lot of times families will have just a word that, like, I don't know, hot tomato or pink elephant or red balloon or something along those lines, where if you text that to me, no questions asked, I will just come get you. And this can be even really helpful for older teens and even college age students who are in a situation where they're worried. And the deal here that you have with your kid is that they will not be in trouble for using that word. So maybe you've got a drunk teen who is really afraid that they're in trouble because they're drunk, right? But they just texted you this word because they want you to come and help them get out of a situation. You'd much rather have that deal with them that you're not going to get in trouble for that and get them out of that situation than be worried about whether or not they're drunk. So kind of like what principle trumps the other principle, if that makes sense. So having a family safe word. Number 9, you will never be in trouble for telling me anything along these lines, even if you think you did something wrong, right? So even if you think that you were part of the play with this kid, or even if you think that maybe, you know, whatever the kid might think, you will never be in trouble as long as you're willing to talk to me about this. Number 10, sometimes, this is a hard one, but this is, I think, really important. Sometimes body touches might tickle or feel good, even secret touches. So that can be really confusing, right? Because part of you is saying, I'm not sure I like this. I'm not sure this is what should be happening. I'm not sure this grown-up should be touching me this way. But part of me feels good about this too. Like some of it feels nice, and that's normal because of course your body, you know, might have an arousal response, or there might be a tension that feels good from the, you know, to the child, things like that. So it's okay to normalize that. Sometimes even if it feels good and it's not safe, that's okay. You can still tell me about it, or you can still, you know, say no, things like that. Number 11 tip. These rules apply with grownups and other kids. So I kind of already covered that. So it's not just about grownups. Number 12, give them your undivided attention on a variety of topics. So I just read an article that kind of called us out as parents who are on, you know, we complain about our kids being on phones all the time, but how many times is your kid talking to you while you're texting something, right? Or you're checking your Facebook, or you're doing something along those lines. Like, do you give your kid undivided attention, at least, you know, 10 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day to talk about their day, look them in the eye, be curious about them, you know, share things with them. Because oftentimes kids will not come to you and say, I have something really important to tell you, mommy and daddy. I think that, you know, Uncle so-and-so touched me in a secret way. Kids will usually say something like, hey, mom, you know, and so I was over at Uncle Joe's and I don't know, it was kind of weird. And, you know, well, what happened? Well, we were watching a weird show. Okay. You know, and you're on your phone clicking away, and you missed kind of the opportunity that kid was kind of testing the waters to see, is this safe or not to talk about? Because it's very, it's very hard to know how to talk about these things, even for kids who are very educated about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that's my last point, is that the stark reality is many do not share that this has ever happened to them. Even when you quote unquote do it all right, and even when you have a really supportive family, and even if you know that you would have responded in a very affirmative, supportive way, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that your kid will talk to you about these kinds of things. So it's kind of a negative note to end on. But I guess the reason I want to say that is because, again, I think it's important to just have an ongoing conversation, and don't assume that just because your kid hasn't come to you about something like this, that something hasn't happened. So watch your language, watch the news, watch things that are in your environment, that you are taking opportunity to always role model appropriate responses when these things are around you. So kids will watch how you react to the fact that, the neighborhood had an issue of this topic, right? Or that there was something on the news about this topic, or, those are all opportunities to kind of give your kids ongoing hints that, hey, we are a safe family. We can talk about this kind of stuff. And because it's just inherently very shameful for kids when they have an experience like this. All right, those are the tips I came up with. Stacy, do you want to take it from there as far as questions, thoughts, insights, disagreements?
I don't think I'd ever disagree, because you're a lot more educated than I am, and I'm just trying to learn as much as I can. I think one of the things that I am probably struggling with is kind of this balance between, I have anxiety about this topic because, like, for instance, I think it was about a month ago, I was just on Facebook and came across like an article that a friend or somebody shared. And it was this mom wrote an article about how her son was sexually abused by an older babysitter, and sharing what that experience was like. And it just, and of course, reading it, it's like, oh my gosh, my anxiety is just getting super high. And I'm like, I need to start, thinking about, because then she gives a list kind of similar to a lot of the things that you just listed. Like, this is what I'm implementing to try to help my kids be more educated and to try to protect them, however you want to call it. And I was just like, oh man, I almost don't even know where to start. I mean, we have talked about, obviously we use correct terms. We've definitely had to have that conversation with our boys in the bathtub, like, don't touch your brother's penis. Like, you can touch your own, but you can't touch anybody else's. So, I mean, we're starting to implement those things, but so that's sort of where I'm coming from, and why I'm just want to have these kinds of conversations and to just learn more. I think you covered a lot of just the types of things to talk about, the type of language to use. So that was kind of like first and foremost my question. So I feel like you covered that really well. Thank you very much. So I think this one question I had, and again, it was brought up in this article where the girl was kind of like, we are open with our loved ones and our babysitters. Like, we have this kind of family safety plan, and we're very open about the fact that we talk to our kids about this. We basically, like, we don't want them to be easy targets, something along those lines. And I'm just wondering, like, is that actually effective? Like, does that sort of make a perpetrator a potential abusive situation? Like, could that really help negate that risk, I guess?
Meaning the idea of being very open with people who are caretakers of your children, that, hey, so we talk to our kids about this, and we're very aware of issues. I can't imagine that not being helpful. I mean, the reality is that perpetrators generally, are drawn to vulnerable children. Okay. So the more vulnerable a family system is, the more risk there is. Again, it's not a guarantee. There's plenty of kids who are sexually assaulted who come from very strong families, and supportive family systems. But it is easier to have access to children when there's, distress or chaos or or just neglect in a home environment. I think too that unfortunately sometimes the vulnerability isn't family related, it's personality. It's like a shy kid, right? Or a kid who may lacks in some self-esteem, and those things can come from really strong family systems as well, right? So there's no like, I guess what I'm saying is that part of why I give that number 13 tip is that you're not going to be able to do everything possible to absolutely mitigate this risk, and so that's a hard thing for any of us as parents to have to face, that, reality. But it's the reality that we face with a lot of risks of parenting, right? None of us are guaranteed that our children will survive childhood, just even from death or accidents or disease, or all kinds of risks that we deal with on a regular basis. So you want to focus a bit on just your own resilience too. I think sometimes, although the goal is obviously to avoid anything of this nature, if possible, the reality is that the statistics are pretty dire. Okay. So 1 in 4 females at this particular point, report some type of unwanted sexual encounter by the time they're 18, and 1 in 6 males report that. Now, the spectrum of what that can entail can be very wide, from penetrative rape to, uncomfortable touch to, voyeurism or exhibitionism to unwanted comments, right? So many of these things count as sexual assault, and are all very serious and very uncomfortable, and can be very traumatic depending on, who the kid is and how often this kind of thing happens and what type of resilience skills kids have. So my thought when I think about this as a parent, quite frankly, I think I've kind of come to the conclusion that I just need to accept that I may not be able to protect my children from sexual assault or from rape or from death or from things that are really horrific, my worst fears, right? That I have as a parent. And then I try to take a step back from that after my little anxiety fit, and just really, like have this idea that, I want my kids to understand that here in the Parker family, we are resilient and we will solve problems. And even if something this horrific happens, we will rally, right? And so I kind of want that to be my stronger message than just preventing bad things from happening. I do think prevention is a huge step, but realizing I can't prevent everything, I want there to be more of this focus on, even if something like that happens, we have the resources and the brain power to figure this out. So whether that means we need to find a good therapist, or whether that means we need to take you out of a certain school system, or whether that means we need to set certain boundaries with family members, including not seeing them anymore, or things of that nature, we can do that. And I want my kids to know that more than anything, we are problem solvers.
Cool. I love that. Thank you. That just made my anxiety go down a lot. Thank you. That's such a good point. Okay, cool. So kind of along those lines, I'm actually just curious, what does treatment or therapy, especially for a younger child, if they are a victim of sexual abuse, what does that look like? I know it would be different, obviously, depending on the situation, but just kind of in general, can you help me understand sort of how that looks?
Yeah. And I'll be very honest that my expertise is not in child therapy.
Okay.
There are people that specialize in what's called play therapy. And I think that, when you're talking about children under the age of 12 in particular, talk therapy is not necessarily a great fit. What 8-year-old wants to come in and say, oh, let me tell you all about my problems, right? So there's a lot of wonderful techniques that child development specialists use, whether it's playing sand tray therapy, there's art therapies, there's all kinds of nice strategies that they have to help kids really deal with trauma through play, which we know kids kind of do that anyway. Kids play out issues. And so a common question I get is, well, how do you even know if a kid has been, sexually abused? If a kid is masturbating too much, or if a kid is, pretending to hump the other kid, or if a kid is acting out inappropriately towards other kids, does that mean that they were sexually abused themselves? And is that where that's coming from? It's very hard to know those things outright. There are warning signs and things that you can look up and kind of get a general idea, but kids masturbate. Kids are curious about their sexuality. Kids, whether kids will do something, it's hard to know too. Like, obviously, if a kid is doing something that you're like, where would they have picked that up from? Pretending to, suck a penis or something like that with a banana and they're 5, that's a concerning thing, because you're like, well, where would they have picked that up from? Yeah. Well, that can be picked up from somebody who's, doing that or forcing them to do that. Mm-hmm. It can also be picked up from accidentally you didn't realize that your kid walked in on you while you were watching pornography, right, yourself. Or it can be picked up from a magazine you have lying around the house, or an sex education book. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean they were abused, but that becomes a higher risk red flag. Okay. When kids are mimicking behavior that you would think was only something they would have seen adults do. But yeah, so play therapy, child development therapy, seeing child specialists, I think those are all things that, I would definitely head in that direction myself if I had any inkling that was happening to one of my kids.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Do we want to go ahead and cut off the Facebook feed?
Yes.
Let's go ahead and cut them off. But guys, we're still going on over at Patreon. So head over to patreon.com/sextalkwithnatasha.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'll be talking about that I forgot to do in my family boundaries is also boundaries with family around appropriate touch, like hugs and kisses and cheek squeezes and all that stuff. So head over to Patreon and we'll continue that conversation there as well. All right. Bye, Facebook.
Thanks, Facebook.